the very first month of Trump, it seemed like Steve Bannon was going to like be the guy really running the White House, and this like extreme far right wing guy. Basically, Cheney is like if that happened for 4 years and he started 2 Vietnams and tortured a bunch of people for no reason. Basically, Cheney's like, well, the VP, and they depict this a lot in Vice, the VP is a member of the executive branch and the legislative. So when it helps me, I'll be in legislative. When it helps me, I'll be in executive. Sometimes I'll be in both, and you can't get me. I'll be both or neither. Like you can't regulate me. He had offices everywhere. He had an office in the CIA. He had one in the Senate, one in the House. Like he's in a position to like be a shadow government, and he probably is.
In the annals of time, riding social forces as they crest and crash onto the shores of history, some would-be heroes stumble but manage to recover their breath. Others are reduced to the flotsam and jetsam of nostalgia. These others are our subjects. They are the vanquished.
Hello and welcome to The Vanquished. Anders J. Lee here with my pal Freddie G.
So happy to be here.
And we are doing something a little different today. We're talking about someone who is technically unvanquished, though, as we will argue, he is vanquished adjacent because, and I hope to do more of these episodes at some point, he was somebody who thought about running for president and did not, which in a way is a vanquishment of sorts. Dick Cheney. Fred, it was your idea to do this episode. Why did you want to talk about Tricky Dick?
He might be trickier than the original Tricky Dick. Yeah, Dick Cheney, the unvanquishable. I see myself as the Dick Cheney of this podcast, slightly older than you, but a weird father figure. I want to talk about Dick Cheney because people are, he's from he had power like 20 years ago. People might not remember how evil he is, and everyone's kind of referencing it, but we can go really into it.
Because he was the real bad guy. I mean, Bush, if you were a young person 20 years ago who was on the left, Bush was a bad guy, but he was also funny and an idiot, and you could make fun of him. Dick Cheney was just pure evil. It was like harder to skewer. It was harder to make light of Dick Cheney because he was so gravely serious. He was like the other side to the Bush coin. Of course, this week, we're recording it after he stepped out and did kind of the unthinkable. Also, if you go back to 20 years ago and told me that Dick Cheney is going to be endorsing a Democratic presidential candidate, a nominee who is a woman of color and is in many ways to the left of, maybe not many ways, but in some ways to the left of his opponents in the aughts, in the Bush administration, the Democrats back then, my head would have exploded. This is kind of bizarre. Obviously, I said on my other show, Pod Damn America, I think this is a bad thing for Kamala Harris and that she should not campaign with the Cheneys because, there are some people out there who may be swayed by this, but they're going to be swayed by just the Cheneys saying that they'll vote for Harris. They don't need to do the rallies and stuff with Liz. It seems like a bad move.
One analogous thing is the very first month of Trump, it seemed like Steve Bannon was going to be the guy really running the White House, and this extreme far right wing guy. Basically, Cheney is if that happened for 4 years and he started 2 Vietnams and tortured a bunch of people for no reason.
Well, on September 6th of this year, Dick Cheney releases a public statement saying that he will vote in the 2024 presidential election for Kamala Harris. This is a day after Liz, his daughter, who is the politician. He's another daughter who's, I don't know what she does, but she's not running for office or anything. She told a crowd, like one of those Q&A live things, that they were both going to vote for Harris. And in Dick's statement, he said that in our nation's 248-year history, there's never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. tried to steal the last election using lies and violence to keep himself in power after the voters had rejected him. He can never be trusted with power again. As citizens, we each have a duty to put country over partisanship to defend our Constitution. That's why I will be voting for Vice President Kamala Harris. So yeah, it's unusual. It makes me not super enthusiastic about Kamala Harris. This is a guy that everyone my age who was on the left basically grew up hating and protesting against the things he was doing. That was my first real political act. So the fact that he is endorsing Harris makes me more skeptical of Harris.
It is weird. Yeah. Yeah. It is weird. Yeah.
So-
Cheney basically was like, he's the most dangerous person in this country. And I'm pissed that he took my title away. That's one problem. Also, Cheney's like, finally a vice president who's more enthusiastic about the wars in the Middle East than me.
Yeah. And that goes to his worldview. He's basically never met a war that he didn't like. He wants to boost the military budget constantly, no limit to that, and is not super interested in domestic policy. He does, want to quote unquote limit the size of government in certain areas. And he's a big believer. This is his real legacy, I think. He's a big believer in unitary executive theory, which, if you've seen Vice, or I guess just, are a little familiar with Dick Cheney, this is something he's been touting since, I believe, the Nixon era, basically saying that the people who wrote the Constitution, what they had in mind was that the president be much more powerful than they currently are, and so the executive should be allowed to do all this stuff like launch wars, for instance, without Congress. And he's
Let me comment. Vice is a good movie. It's by Adam McKay, and thank God Adam McKay is not a guy who's like all out for Kamala. He's very upset about Palestine and climate change, so he's been criticizing Kamala, and that's good because it'd be weird if the Vice guy who made that movie bashing Dick Cheney about 10 years ago was then like, vote for Kamala, me and Dick Cheney are with her.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, unitary executive is basically, I don't know if it's about everything, definitely war, but it's that anything the executive is involved in, they have complete control, and Congress and the court should stay out of it, and they have power. Maybe Congress has a few powers here and there, but the executive is it's basically the president is kind of a king. It's kind of Alexander Hamilton even.
Yeah. Another through line with Cheney is he's very in favor of pollution. It seems that is something I remember from the Bush years that I assume we'll get into, is he would meet with like oil execs and basically let them write a lot of regulations and stuff, or at least proposals.
Yeah, Trump has a Captain Planet villain vibe, but Dick Cheney has an even bigger one.
Yeah.
Dick Cheney he's a real life Captain Planet villain.
Right. And as you said, you actually have, I don't know if this is a joke that you wrote in the notes, or this is actually
this is in one of the books.
This is in the
said
books.
He took Dick Cheney took one of those like corrupted personality tests. I took it. I got tax accountant. That's another way I could have gone. Yeah, very different than leftist podcaster comic. But yeah, his ideal job, and this fits, is funeral director. And he has a funeral director voice and vibe for sure.
Yes. That is funny. Well, let's go back to his early years, which I thought, this is something I remember from Vice, because I had a friend at the time who didn't like the movie, and his reason was that it had, quote unquote, no sympathetic characters. And my response to that was basically, if you come out of Vice sympathizing with Dick Cheney, then it probably is not doing its job. Movies that are about bad people don't have to be sympathetic to those people. I mean, you have to understand them, but I just think that's a weird criterion. But I will say the early stuff about his earlier life did resonate a little bit. I was somewhat sympathetic to the young Dick Cheney, who was kind of I didn't realize this, but was kind of a fuck up, if I may.
Yeah, him and George W. Bush have a lot in common. He's like like I said, 5 years older and like a weird father figure. Yeah, I rewatched the movie Vice, and it is good. And the way history works is it's a story of bad people, but there is sort of a stand-in character who's the narrator, who's like a stand-in for all of us who are sympathetic as the victims of Dick Cheney's policies.
Right. So he grew up in Wyoming, and had trouble in school and stuff. He, like his president, George W. Bush, has been arrested for driving under the influence. I think Bush just got one, if I'm not mistaken. Cheney got two. November 1962, he's 21 years old, convicted of DWI. And then a year later, same thing. But this made him think about where he was in life and where he was headed. And he was headed down a bad road if I continued on that course, he says, which I wouldn't blame the road. It's more the you driving drunk,
I am thinking he's basically Tim Walz's Wario. Like they both have DWIs. They're both from like that same region, Wyoming, Nebraska and North Dakota, all that. They kind of have that vibe. But then they come together because they're both very pro-Israel bombing people in the Middle East. Right. So, yeah, they can unite on that, on foreign policy. And domestic policy, they're pretty opposite. But on foreign policy, they're more united.
Right. Do you know how he meets Lynn Cheney? I know that's in the movie.
Oh, they're high school sweethearts. Yeah, so he's from Wyoming. He's in a Wyoming high school. He's kind of a stud in high school. I think he's on some sports teams. He's riding high. He's big man in high school. It's in the small, like Wyoming. He's really into her. And then when he asked her out, he's surprised she's into him. And then they've kind of just been together ever since. He was at Yale. He wasn't trying to like sleep with a bunch of sorority girls. He was loyal to Lynn. But he's at Yale. He flunks out of Yale a couple times. And yeah, Lynn and him have been very loyal to each other. And in the movie, and I think also in real life, like she kind of gives him the come to Jesus moment. She's like, you're not going to be a drunk lineman for the county. In other words, you're not going to be a worker. You need to like have power and do evil. So he goes back to school and gets a poli-sci degree. He's going to be a poli-sci kind of like doctor guy, but then he decides to become a practitioner instead.
Well, good for him. He also gets out of going to Vietnam, and he, I think probably tried to do this intentionally. He got deferments, including Liz Cheney ended up being a deferment because he had a kid, so that was a reason to not go. Although they were, I'm sure they were drafting dads.
Oh no! What they do is they make a rule that, like, at first they're not drafting college students. He's in college. Then they're not drafting married people. He's married, which I don't think was time for that. And then they make a rule that, like, we're going to draft married people, but not if you have a kid. And Liz Cheney was born 9 months and 2 days later, so Liz may have been a drafted permit baby. Also, if he was, he loves war. If he was gung-ho about serving war, like Teddy Roosevelt loved war, but he would go over there. They had to keep him out of World War I when he was like 50 and going to die on a horse. But like, if he wanted to, he could have gone. But he was always finding a way to get deferred. And then finally, he's 26 and not eligible anymore. And and that's actually good because the war was not wrapping up. He's also lucky to be a little bit older too.
Yeah. Well, he does admit when he's asked about it in 1989, he says, I had other priorities in the 60s than military service. And this is when he's being confirmed as Secretary of Defense. And yeah, he gets 6 deferments. Or excuse me, he gets his college career is 6 years instead of 4. And that is in part because he was not a good student. And so it took longer. And he also had to work through college. He uses. Go ahead.
But yeah, one theme with the Iraq War is that people who didn't serve are much more into going into Iraq than people who did serve.
Right.
So like Colin Powell's a soldier. He's like, this is going to be a bit much. And then Cheney and Bush and I don't think Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz served either. They're much more excited about going to war. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Rumsfeld's more of a Congress guy. He
Well,
might
he
have been
was
born in
a
the gap.
pilot. He was a pilot. I think he may have been a pilot in Korea, but I don't think he saw action during Vietnam.
Oh, okay, yeah, he might be. He's more the. Yeah, he's a bit older. He might be more the Korea generation. Rumsfeld might be the one guy who's crazy enough to have served and wanted to do the Iraq War. Though we'll
Yeah.
get to it later. He gets a little bored of it pretty quick.
Right. But yeah, very similar to Bush in some of the younger stuff. You know, like you said, both chicken hawks. He gets a hardship deferment, quote unquote, available to men with dependents. And then yeah, by age 26, they're not drafting people that age. He becomes a Republican in sort of an interesting way. I know you know about this.
Oh yeah, so he becomes he is in political science, but then he becomes a staffer. I think this is like 68, so it might still be LBJ. And there's him and another staffer, and the other guy's like, I want to be with the Democrats, and Cheney's like, okay, I'll be a Republican. So it's pretty random that he even becomes a Republican, but then by the end of his career, he's a hardcore Republican.
Yeah, he's a very strong partisan. He does work in the Nixon administration, right? What does he do there?
He's working for the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is the opposite is what you would think of with Dick Cheney. Basically, Nixon would put a guy like Rumsfeld in charge of like a Great Society type office because he knew that Rumsfeld hated that shit and would wind it down. And then they're also in charge of like price controls, and they have to do some price controls, but like Dick is like, I hate these things.
Yeah.
Like it definitely. It's Nixon sabotaging stuff, kind of like when Trump would appoint like the head of the EPA as a guy who sued the EPA to try to get it out of existence.
Right. And he also, so apparently, Rumsfeld was not in Korea. He was a pilot for the Navy a little later, so he didn't see any action, and you know that. So he said has something to do with whether or not you're willing to send other troops into harm's way. But I remember reading something that when they first met, they didn't like each other, but then eventually they became comrades. At one point, though, Cheney almost becomes the press secretary for Ted Kennedy. How does that happen?
There's something where it's like, oh, we should switch these people around. And like they sign a paper, him and another guy who's working for Ted Kennedy, they sign papers saying that they switch, but they don't actually switch. And it's not because it's not that Cheney's like anti-Ted Kennedy, though he'll get there eventually. It's just like he likes who he's working for at the time. But he says in one of the Cheney biographies, he says, there's a piece of paper somewhere that says that I was Ted Kennedy's press secretary. And that would be kind of funny if he worked for Ted Kennedy and become this like left-wing leader who was like busy raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, we could have used a Dick Cheney on the left.
He could get that wage up. Yeah, he's very effective when he wants something.
Yeah. Well, after Rumsfeld is promoted, I believe he becomes Gerald Ford's Secretary of Defense, right?
Absolutely.
So Cheney then becomes the chief of staff, and in 1976, he loses election because Ford was never elected in the first place. And he is there for the concession. He is the one to tell. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so basically Ford is like, Ford's like, well, we could contest a couple states, but I lost the popular vote, so it wouldn't be right. Which is obviously not something Cheney will stick by. And then Ford's like, he calls Jimmy Carter. He's like, congratulations, I'm hoarse from all this campaigning or whatever. Here's Dick Cheney to read the rest of my concession statement to you on the call. So Dick Cheney has never been vanquished himself, but he did get to read a presidential concession speech, which is very Vanquished adjacent. Yeah.
Right. When Ford calls Jimmy Carter, he says, Governor, my voice is gone, but I want to give you my congratulations. Here's Dick Cheney. And then Jimmy Carter has to talk to Dick Cheney, which is never a pleasant experience.
Almost not worth winning the presidency at that point.
Yeah. So then Cheney runs for Congress in Wyoming, and Wyoming is one of those states where you just have one member of the House of Representatives, and he's big foreign policy guy, even coming from Wyoming. I know there's like nuclear missile silos in North Dakota. I don't know if there's any in Wyoming, but I feel like maybe that contributes to people's political development in that area. Maybe not, but
I think, oh yeah, so that came in. So basically, he's just running on like I'm pro Wyoming values, like we're more conservative, that kind of stuff. He does get a heart attack during the campaign, and then Lynn has to campaign for him while he's in the hospital bed. And Lynn, it's definitely their marriage is very much a partnership. So Lynn is great at it and helps get him over the top. And then I think the first election might be kind of close, but once he wins, he's in good shape. And there's actually a very good chance in Congress, if he hadn't left to be Secretary of Defense under the first Bush, he would have become like a Speaker of the House type guy. And he could have been like kind of like a Mitch McConnell type figure, which is kind of his vibe anyway.
Yeah, definitely into the Cold War. He helps in Congress pass a lot of funding for weapons systems. And he is an ally to Reagan throughout the Iran-Contra scandal. He, of course, wants to give them weapons with public money. So when they find out that there's a workaround that Reagan is using, a lot of people are upset, but Cheney is a steadfast defender. Sure.
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry. So, yeah, basically, he might agree that Reagan broke the law, but he doesn't think Congress should make a law telling the president not to give the weapons. And then Cheney is on that committee that's investigating. And some Republicans are kind of like, going against Reagan. And Cheney's like, my job on this committee is to be the lawyer for Reagan. So he's on the committee and he's helping push to defend Reagan on there.
And meanwhile, he's voting against Head Start funding. He's voting against abortion, the Equal Rights Amendment, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. And according to some scoring, he's to the right of Gingrich by 1 point. You found some more hateable votes from the Dick Cheney Wikipedia. He voted against creating the Department of Education. She thought was going to lead to budget deficits, and it was going to encroach on states' rights, which is interesting turn of phrase.
It is weird, but yeah, the GOP's now for getting rid of education. But Bush, both Bushes were okay with it, because obviously No Child Left Behind is the Department of Education thing. So it is where Cheney worked for Bushes and he worked for Ford, and these guys are a little bit more moderate on some of like the hardcore libertarian stuff. But in his heart, he's much more of a Reaganite. And when Reagan's in power, he gets to really go after it. And when he has power under Bush, George W. Bush, he gets to push that kind of stuff, that super small government, make it so small that I can easily kill it.
Right. Drown it in the bathtub, as Governor Bush said. Yeah.
Yeah. They must be buddies. They've have hunted or fished together at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. Cheney, at the time, Reagan had talked about getting rid of the Department of Education. Now, something he obviously didn't get to do as president, but that was like a conservative issue item for a while. He was against Martin Luther King Day for a while. In 1978, he voted against it. But in 83, he changes his mind on that, votes for it. 86,
flip-flopper.
Yeah. John Kerry should have mentioned that, actually. That would have been
good.
Yeah, why wouldn't he say, like, well, you flip-flopped on whether or not Martin Luther King Day should be a federal holiday?
If I could go back in time, I would have Edward say it in the VP debate instead of the calling Mary Cheney a lesbian that didn't get them anything, and that might have changed the momentum.
Yeah, perhaps. Also on South African apartheid, Reagan in 86 vetoes a bill that would have put sanctions on South Africa, and Congress. I don't know. Do you know if the veto succeeded, or were they able to override it? I'm not sure, but
I can't remember. I know this is towards the end of a part because Mandela is getting out a few years after. This is pretty late in the whole thing. So yeah, but he's he does say he's not a huge sanctions guy. I know he's against Iranian sanctions when he's for Haliburton. But yeah, Cheney's just if there's a vote, he's going to come down on the side of racism most of the time.
Yeah, he votes to not override the veto. That's interesting that I didn't know he was anti. I guess I didn't really think about him being anti-sanctions. I mean, I'm sure he's for some sanctions, but that was a thing that would come up in both Gulf Wars. Is like people would say, and not a slogan I would advise, but people would say sanctions not war, sanctions not war. And I guess Cheney was anti-sanctions like a lot of people on the left are, but his rationale was that we have to do war instead.
The big thing is for the contractors, for the global companies, sanctions could cost them money, and he's on the side of those companies. And and obviously he's going to be in charge of one of those. And then as VP, he's going to help Haliburton a lot. We'll get to that.
Yeah. So in 1984,
It's just a picture of him. I put a couple pictures. In 1984, he was kind of handsome. If you want, Google him in 1984. Yeah, at some points in his life, he was sort of handsome. That was his peak looks-wise. I don't think he was good-looking younger or older, but that was his peak. I feel like I'm in my peak right now.
We'll see. I might be in mine soon. I'm getting the white hair in my beard. Sorry, I'm just going to make a note to edit around here. All right. So later, after Reagan's vice president is elected, George H.W. Bush, and Cheney becomes his Secretary of Defense. He does sort of oddly in retrospect help reduce the defense budget because there was a call to do this, and they did do it to a slight effect after the Cold War, after Soviet Russia collapses. Because it kind of becomes consensus that we don't need to spend all this money, so he does cut the budget a little bit, and he at that point is publicly anyway all right with banning gays from serving in the military. I wonder how he thought privately, and he was instrumental in the overthrow, the invasion of Panama to depose Manuel Noriega.
I saw a doc on this once. Like it was a real bad. Like we did a lot of destruction over there, and Noriega had been a U.S. ally. Like there's a doc about it that's pretty bad. So
Panama syndrome, I believe it is.
So it's real. Yeah, like this Bush gets to look tough, but it's like we killed a bunch of innocent people. I'm sure we didn't really help Panama too much.
Noriega was a U.S. ally for a while, and then Bush turned against him. Was calling him a drug runner and all this stuff, and so there's an attempt at a military coup, and then the U.S. Sends in troops, and they just kind of wreak mayhem on the people of Panama. There is Panama Syndrome says or Panama Deception rather. That's the name of the movie. That a laser was used, which I don't know if that's true or not, but this is around the time that we're scaling down overall spending on hard weaponry or bases and stuff like that. We don't need as many of those, but we are spending more on new military technologies to fight the wars of the future. And according to some witnesses, they say they saw a laser. It may have been a flamethrower or something else, but they were definitely utilizing a lot of new weird technology in the Panama operation just to kind of play with it essentially. And Cheney probably had a hand in that.
Yeah, that is Cheney's vibe. But Bond villain. Also, people compare him to Darth Vader. He even makes a video at some point about it, or he's into it. He's really more of the emperor though. And so lasering, some foreign area and killing people, that's really on brand for him.
So then you have the Gulf War in 1991. Which he didn't plan this, you said, but he did help facilitate it. as Secretary of Defense.
So basically, like the military design, he's not a military man. Like the generals designed the plan, Schwarzkopf and I would assume Powell. They designed the plan, but he's helping getting it going. He's like a sponge for information. Like he's really into it. I think he even has like his lieutenant do the rest of the job. So he's very into the Gulf War. But if you're like, well, Fred, that was a really well-run war. Well, he's not the one who made that plan. Though at the time he is okay with not taking out Saddam. So he gets some credit for that, though he doesn't stick to that in the 2000s.
Yeah. And so Cheney and Schwarzkopf have a plan for a full-scale military operation. Powell says that Cheney has become a glutton for information with an appetite we could barely satisfy. He spent hours in the National Military Command Center peppering staff with questions. And I think he's probably interested in what it would perhaps hypothetically take to take over Iraq, to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which Bush the first does not do. And it seems like everybody around him is basically satisfied with that. Although, I think Cheney was probably thinking about it perhaps for a future war. But he does say throughout the 90s, and this is a question they would get. All the people in the first Bush administration would get this question from 1991 to 2002, 2003, that like, well, why didn't you go into Iraq and get Saddam? And he says it would have been a quagmire. If we'd done that, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anyone else with us. And the U.S. would have had to occupy Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. And once you got to Iraq and took it over, took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? It's a very volatile part of the world. If you take down the central government of Iraq, you could very easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Like the Syrians would try to have the West. And the Iranians would like to claim the eastern part that they fought over for 8 years, and the north you have the Kurds. Turkey, it would be a quagmire again if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. There would have been a lot of casualties. And he does note that for the 146 Americans in the Gulf War that were officially killed, because there were some more people who died from injuries when they came home, for them, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for George H.W. Bush, in terms of whether or not we went to Baghdad, is how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? Not Iraqis, but at least he's thinking about some people's lives. And he says, our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right. I would love to have that Dick Cheney talk to 2002 Dick Cheney, 2003 Dick Cheney.
So there is a thing of that a lot of like really evil Republicans who are very savvy strategically say if Bush had kept the Gulf War going on through the election, he wins re-election. Nixon's able to do this for the 72 election because he ends Vietnam right afterwards. And then obviously Bush, the second Bush is able to keep the Iraq war still going on. Maybe he didn't want it to be, and that helps. So the idea is to face re-election as a wartime president. And they may regret that if Bush had done that, he would have been able to get re-election.
That's an interesting counterfactual. I think there's something to that, as we saw. But I mean, yeah, that's interesting.
It's very sad, also.
Well, of course, Bush loses in 1992. Cheney is no longer Secretary of Defense, but he does. I just looked this up because, I was curious. There's no war, essentially, that he's not going to be in favor of. And he was in favor of Somalia, Operation Restore Hope, and made the case to George H.W. Bush that they couldn't settle it in his term, before his term was up. So they basically gave the keys to that operation to the Clinton administration. And it seems that Cheney was at least okay with that. And I don't know, maybe he would say that Clinton mismanaged the project, and yet, maybe he would have blamed him for Black Hawk Down or something. But it seems like in general he was for that, and at a time when a lot of Republicans. This is more so after the Battle of Mogadishu. A lot of Republicans were criticizing Dick Cheney, or excuse me, criticizing Clinton for messing up. But he does consider running in 1996, which is another fun counterfactual. I think I kind of wish he did, because he would have lost so badly that he would have been, Bush may not have considered him, depending on how bad he lost. But I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, he takes a drive across the country to think about it. So the movie Vice says he didn't run because his daughter's a lesbian, and then that would come out. Other things Dick Cheney was like, he didn't want to be fundraising for the rest of his life or for the next couple of years. This is early '95, so it'd take a couple of years to run. One thing says he would be a second tier candidate. I don't think he could have beat Bob Dole because he makes Bob Dole seem like he has a lot of charisma. Another big flaw Cheney would have running as a candidate is he doesn't like talking about himself. So he doesn't want to tell his story, and you do need to become a brand. And Dick Cheney never wanted to become a brand. And whenever he does become a brand, the brand is generally an evil, unlikable one. Like he leaves as VP with like a 10% approval rating.
Right. And, as you said earlier, he is not that interested in domestic policy. And this is the mid-90s. The Cold War is over. What is he going to run on, doing? Who does he want to go to war with in 1995, 1996? I guess the obvious answer would be Saddam Hussein, but he already said around that same time, after the Gulf War, he was already saying, that would have been a bad idea, and I'm glad we didn't do it. So what is it? He wants a more hawkish foreign policy, but against who? I don't know what he would have campaigned on at that time. But there is a little bit I dug up from the New York Times where they interview Bill Kristol, who's a neocon, friend of Cheney, apparently Dan Quayle's chief of staff. And he said, it's true. Kristol worked for Dan Quayle, which I didn't realize. But he said Dick Cheney learned that foreign policy is just not on anyone's radar screen right now. And then also adds, you have to be a little bit crazy to run for president. And Dick Cheney is a very sane man, which does, I think, confirm the thesis that he is evil. He knows what he's doing, and he's just a bad guy.
He might be a psychopath. He's cool. Like on 9/11, he's like fine. He's a very calm guy. He's not. He wants power, but he's not an ego guy. He doesn't want like the fans. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he's the least likely. Most politicians kind of want to be stand-up comics, and like Dick Cheney is the one who least wants that.
Yeah. So he doesn't run for president, but he does become CEO of Haliburton, which has, I don't know if they changed their name or not, but they're not as in the news at the tip of everyone's tongue as they were like 20 years ago. Like everyone was talking about Haliburton because there's just very obvious conflict of interest that we'll get to, that he works for this company and then becomes vice president and executes a war that gets them boatloads of money. But before that, he's their CEO in the 90s. He makes lots of money, and this drags him even more to the right. And this might start, making him rethink yet again the first Bush administration's decision not to topple Saddam. But he does oversee a unique business model that Haliburton has, that I know you read up on.
Yeah, I read a book called Haliburton's Army by a guy named Chatterjee. That's his last name. In general, so Haliburton, it's oil services. So like basically going to places around the world where evil's being done and helping extract the oil. And then they get into military contracting, and they may even buy a military contractor. And I had read a book about like in the 1800s, the railroads were a scam. Like they built a bunch of railroads just to take government money. And in the 1900s, 2000s version, this is military contracting. They just bill the government for lots and lots of stuff. They deliver it poorly. And then and to actually do the work, they don't pay the workers a lot. They hire people from poor countries like the Philippines. They pay them like, a terrible wage, and they don't treat them well if they don't give them good workman's comp if they get injured. And they just basically just extract money from the government to privatize stuff like military janitors and stuff like that for our volunteer army. So that's their business model. Basically, is just global corruption. And yeah, that would make sense that you'd be okay with even unsuccessful war in Iraq, because it's a great place for some global corruption.
Yeah. Well, during his tenure at Haliburton, they shift their accounting practices where revenue they just have a different way of calculating disputed costs on construction projects. And then eventually he has to resign. This says he resigned on July 25th, 2000, which I guess, would be around the time he was selected as vice president. But he's already working for Bush while he's the CEO of Haliburton, because he was one of the people who was tasked with finding Bush's running mate.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you know, he decided on himself. I mean, there are different accounts that he didn't want to do it, and Bush was really adamant that it's got to be you, for some weird reason. Because, I mean, really only political advantage to Cheney is he adds experience, and Bush had been governor of Texas for 5-6 years when he ran for president, so that's something he wanted more of. But other than that, this guy really adds nothing politically. Like, he's an attack dog, and I guess that's part of it, but he's not charismatic. He doesn't really appeal to any distinct base of people who are Cheney fans. It's a weird pick in retrospect.
I think Bush thought he'd be good to help him govern. He'd been a chief of staff, and Bush knew zero about foreign policy. So it's just, Bush is very much a domestic policy guy, education reform, that kind of stuff. Obviously, lower taxes, and his dream is to privatize Social Security that he never gets to do. But yeah, just get a foreign policy guy there. Bush does ask Cheney to be on the short list. Cheney says no, but I'll lead the committee. And when he leads the committee, either it's Bush kind of manipulates him into accepting the job, or Cheney uses the committee to impugn all the other candidates. And then he makes a deal with Bush where before he's offered it, he obviously gets Bush to offer him a lot of power and becomes one of the most powerful VPs. So yeah. Cheney is good at manipulating things to get himself the best deal.
Right. Yeah. And meanwhile, he's still getting money from Haliburton. Even though he's stepped down, he gets deferred compensation, even as vice president. And he has a net worth that's between $19 and $86 million, which is a pretty large swing. Yeah. You take the year 2006, joint income with Lynn Cheney is $8.82 million. So this guy's, like a lot of politicians, is loaded. He's also involved in this organization, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. What do they do, and what was his role with them?
Yeah, so it's basically Jews for like a hawkish neocon right-wing foreign policy in Israel and the region. There's a lot of Jewish ex-military people there. And he's on the board, and it definitely informed. It makes sense because there is Israel was one of the countries pushing for the war in Iraq. So that makes sense. And then also later on when Israel is going to be fighting in Lebanon, he's very hawkish on that. So it does make sense that at least he has a tie to kind of the Zionist end of the neocon foreign policy.
Yeah. And then he's elected vice president. I don't think he swung any states on behalf of George Bush, but he is, a party at least to what happened in Florida. I don't know if he was in on any of that, but he, it's amazing to me to watch him and Liz Cheney now just act appalled at, and I think they are on some level genuinely appalled at January 6th. But it's, I don't know if there's a voice deep down in their heads that feels guilty, because I don't understand how that's any different from what's called the Brooks Brothers riot, which happened in Florida after the 2000 election. There's a recount, and all these Republican operatives wearing nice clothes, which is why it's called the Brooks Brothers riot. They intimidate the officials into not counting the ballots, and whether or not that actually would have led to Gore's victory, I think, is another question. But it's just pretty blatant, right? This is I just don't know what the difference is between that and like a bunch of guys in Carhartt jackets having like a riot at the Capitol.
Yeah.
I guess it's the aesthetics are slightly different, but I think the real difference is that Bush and Cheney won. They were able to be successful in fixing that election, and Trump was too incompetent, or it just wasn't possible to overturn the 2020 election.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So with the way during the recount time, they basically have James Baker be in charge of it. He was, I believe, he was Bush's chief of staff at some point. So they have a guy who both is tied to the Bushes and who Cheney definitely worked with because they were in the same administration. He runs it. He's not going to be part of the new administration. He's kind of taking charge of all the corrupt stuff. And Cheney, meanwhile, is head of transition team. And Bush basically lets Cheney pick his first cabinet. To a large extent, obviously Condi's going to be in there, and there's a few Bush people in there, but Cheney is Cheney is really taking charge of the new administration in a way that a VP doesn't usually get to do. And they do mention in the Vice movie how like they set it up where the emails are all going to be in a private RNC server, so the a lot of Bush emails never got recovered, especially the ones leading up to the Iraq War, and especially ones relating to Cheney. So they set up something that's like a worse version of the whole Hillary Clinton email server thing that happens later on.
Right. Well, so after he's sworn in as vice president, he helps squash the Kyoto protocols, which is an environmental agreement. And Bush has already said that, he's ran on pretending to be an environmentalist. I don't think it was, that convincing to anybody, but he had at least said he wanted to stay in Kyoto, and they get rid of it. And
yeah, these guys are interesting because they love nature. So there'll be a lot of pictures of nature. Cheney's favorite thing is fly fishing. He likes hunting. They like being in nature, but they like oil and letting oil companies do whatever they want. So they like nature for them, but they're willing to have it destroyed. But they can kind of pretend to be like nature guys. And compassionate conservatism is, I guess, the idea of like you can like oil companies and care about climate change.
Yeah. Those first 8 months with the Bush administration, the first 8 months of 2001, I think are kind of understudied because it's, he was comically bad at his job and just, a laughably stupid and incompetent president. And I'm not sure if the image of Cheney, what that was like, if he was seen as evil as he would become in a lot of people's eyes in the years after, but just a clown show. They had the show That's My Bush on Comedy Central, making fun of them. But and then that all changes, of course, on 9/11, which should have been prevented. And this is, something we said in the John Kerry episode, is that like how do you not run on them letting 9/11 happen? There's intelligence reports, and, I'll get to this in a second, but I think this is perhaps, there is maybe something to some of those 9/11 conspiracies and Dick Cheney. But what do you think, or what did you find out about his time during that fateful day?
Yeah. So before 9/11, I mean, he just had every resource at his disposal possible to prevent 9/11, Dick Cheney. I don't know what he was doing. I don't know what information he got, but he was hooked in. And he's very much the foreign policy guy. Bush is out on the ranch and not so focused on foreign policy. Condi, national security advisor, is very inexperienced. Yeah. So then on 9/11, Bush is in Florida reading My Pet Goat, and then afterwards, kind of just trying to fly back all day and going to like secure locations. Cheney's in the White House. They pull him out. He takes a copy of, I believe, the Financial Times. He's like, maybe this will be boring in case I need to read. But then he's in like the underground bunker. He's running things, and they're like, well, there's a plane flying in Pennsylvania that's going towards the Capitol or whatever. Should we shoot it down? And he says, shoot it down as quick as a batter recognizes to swing at a pitch, they say in one of the books. So he's like locked in. He's ready to do stuff. He gives the order. It's unclear if he talked to Bush or not before that, but to shoot down an American airliner. Well, everything you read then says that it was shot down. I mean, sorry, that it crashed coincidentally before that order ever got to the pilots. But there's conspiracy theories about that. As far as if we shot down that plane in Pennsylvania, I remember talking to a Marine who had enlisted after 9/11. And he said, based on what he had heard, that they had definitely shot it down. So I don't know. I'm open to all kinds of theories, but yeah, Cheney is just running shit on 9/11 while Bush is kind of scrambling to change posture.
Yeah. Well, I will say, so there's a book called The Road to 9/11 by Peter Dale Scott, which I would recommend. Most of it is just kind of a history of American foreign policy in the late 20th century. But the final chapters are about the 9/11 Commission report and the inconsistencies. And there is a big dispute as to when Cheney got into that command center, that room, because it's likely he got there after 10 a.m. just based on there's someone who says that there are witnesses who said that he definitely got there after, which conflicts with the official story. And there's certain orders that were given before 10 a.m. that were supposedly given by Cheney. And the no shoot down order is, it's tough to know exactly what happened, but there's no official record of Bush giving Cheney a shoot down order. And there is at least one account that during a certain period of time there was the policy was to not shoot down a plane, and this is the one that was going to the Pentagon. And Cheney's being told the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out, plane is 10 miles out, and there's a young staffer there who says, and this is all according to Norman Mineta, who's like a witness there on that day. Cheney's asked, do the orders still stand to not shoot down the plane? And Cheney whips his neck around and says, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? So I don't know. I mean, I definitely am not one who thinks that the Bush administration did 9/11 and, put bombs and stuff in the World Trade Center, or that they shot a missile at the Pentagon. Like, that's been debunked, I think, pretty thoroughly. But I think there is a case that they knew it was going to happen and let it happen. But yeah, it's a very granular sort of debate that does hinge on like what time do you get into this room and all that stuff. But
yeah, I definitely hear about him giving the shoot down order ahead of when the plane crashes in Pennsylvania. I didn't hear the Pentagon part, but at some point I think they do agree to give a shoot down order. But yeah, obviously it's not before the Pentagon stuff.
Right. Yeah. And this is, all according to one guy, Norman Mineta, who was the Secretary of Commerce, but who knows what actually happened. We probably will never get that full story, but after 9/11, the world has changed, and there's anthrax attack in the U.S. My family was living in the D.C. area at the time, and my mom actually worked for the Capitol. She worked for the Capitol building, and her office was, they had to be, I think, evacuated because of anthrax, and that is like right after 9/11, and it's just things are getting crazy. But there was something involving the anthrax and rats that you found out about involving
Yeah,
Dick
they
Cheney?
sent at some point. They're like botulism poisoning might have been sent to the VP's office, and Cheney, if it was sent, you're gonna die. And they're like, we're gonna test it on what was sent on in rats. If their tails are up, you're good. If their tails are down, you're dead. And it's funny because it's like botulism, and now that's the same or a similar type of stuff that's used in Botox. So back then, Botox was your worst nightmare. But Cheney getting Botox back then would have been the VP getting killed by a chemical weapon. So things have changed in some way. Our Botox views have changed a lot since 9/11.
Imagine if just after that, there's now skinny Dick Cheney, or just has like his face is all like chatted up now, and he's like high cheekbones and stuff. I mean, I will say, if you look at that photo of him from high school, it's like a totally different guy, and he was, like you said, he was a stud in high school. I think he played sports or something. He's got like rings. He's got the nice hairdo, and let himself go. But after 9/11, there's a.
Can we take a quick? Can we take a bathroom break real quick?
Sure.
And we'll roll through the rest. Sorry. And we only.
So there is a quote from after 9/11. Zbigniew Brzezinski says that the world has been terrorized by the war on terror. This moment in American history created a culture of fear throughout the country. The Bush administration, and this is Brzezinski writing, their elevation of war on terror, these three words, into a national mantra since the horrific events of 9/11 has had a pernicious impact on American democracy, on America's psyche, and on U.S. standing in the world. Using this phrase has actually undermined our ability to effectively confront the real challenges we face from fanatics who may use terrorism against us. The damage these three words have done, a classic self-inflicted wound, is infinitely greater than any wild dreams entertained by the fanatical perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks when they're plotting it in Afghanistan. The phrase itself is meaningless, neither defines a geographic context nor our presumed enemies. Terror is not an enemy, but a technique of warfare, political intimidation through the killing of unarmed non-combatants. I don't know if I think we maybe didn't mention this in the John Kerry episode, but there's a line where he says his goal is to reduce terror to a nuisance like prostitution or gambling. And Cheney hits him for this and says, well, that fundamentally misunderstands the threat, and terror must be eliminated. It must. So basically saying that no one will commit this crime, this act. We'll have a world, tantamount to saying we'll have a world free from theft or murder. If you think about what they're saying, that is extremely ambitious, even impossible to have no one committing an act of quote unquote terrorism, which is, kind of a loaded term to begin with. Political violence. No one's going to ever do that ever, is just, it's something you could only get away with saying at that point. Cheney.
Oh yeah, I do want to add, first of all, you have gambling and prostitution. Those should be legal. So it's funny that John Kerry, I guess John Kerry would legalize terrorism at that point. But yeah, the big thing is like 9/11 kills 2,000 people, which is horrible. But the wars we did afterwards killed like 1,000 times that many people, and almost all of them are innocent. Also, and none of those wars improved anything. The Taliban's back. Iraq's a mess. It's even hard to keep track of it. Blowback's done good seasons on both those things, and yeah, it's just it was just senseless killing, and it didn't bring anybody's lives back.
Right. And you have, kickstarting a lot of this stuff, the Patriot Act, which Dick Cheney is instrumental in crafting. What does this do? You said this is kind of his wet dream.
Yeah, I just feel like everything in there, it's just full government surveillance of electronic communication. Well, and I didn't get into all the details, but just really, we kind of lost our right to privacy at that point if we hadn't already lost it. And yeah, it's something Dick Cheney loves. And then 03, they're trying to at least get rid of the domestic metadata sweeps, which is basically if I call Anders, we're both in America, but they can like sweep us into some kind of terrorism thing. And Cheney's pushing hard to not get rid of those. And this is the time when Ashcroft's in the hospital and they have to try to push him to sign it. And I think James Comey is actually acting attorney general at that point and pushing against it.
Well, you also have, you wrote in the notes, the Hague Invasion Act.
Yeah, I had never heard of that till after October 7th. But basically, sometime in 2002, America passes a law that says, like, if you want to try an American at the Hague for war crimes, we will invade the Hague, which I assume does not have much of an army. It is part of Holland. And we basically said war crimes laws don't apply to us. And it was kind of us announcing that we are going to commit a lot of war crimes. It's not talked about any of the sources about Cheney, but I just remembered it. And because people were like, well, all this after October 7th, you're criticizing Israel. Why don't you criticize America? How come America didn't get any war crimes trouble after 9/11? It's like, well, we declared that war crimes laws don't apply to us because we will destroy the Hague.
Man. And this law passed? Is it still on the books?
I Googled it at the time, and it's still on the books. Yeah. I Googled it like last October. Yeah, it's a real thing.
I assume it's not called the Hague Invasion Act, is it? That's crazy.
Now I got to look.
American Service Members Protection Act. Okay, so yeah, we can commit war crimes. I mean, that was an issue in the 2004 race. You can hear Bush bringing up at the debate. He's like, "We're not going to join the ICJ like my opponent wants to do." Basically, yeah, openly saying, "Let's commit war crimes." Cheney says on Afghanistan, which is invaded shortly after 9/11, that it's a failed state, so they don't count towards the Geneva Convention, even though the Afghani government signed the Geneva Convention. We shouldn't recognize that as legitimate because they're a failed state. Therefore, we can just do whatever we want there.
Yeah, this is the general idea. It's like America doesn't torture because if America does it, it's not torture. That's a general thing. It's just it's very much the Richard Nixon. If the president does it, it's not illegal. I think an earlier Afghani government had signed the Geneva Convention, and Cheney's like, well, this is the Taliban. They're not the same. Yeah, we can torture them.
Yeah. Well, they do set up black sites, of course. They start using Guantanamo Bay to torture people. This ends up killing 43 people as a result of these tactics. And to this day, there is, despite what you see in pop culture and movies like Zero Dark 30, there is no evidence that this torture saved anyone's life. It killed 43 people, but it didn't actually save anyone's life.
Yeah, and the standard was basically like if there's no organ failure or death, it's not torture. Now, death isn't torture, that's murder. And organ failure tends to lead to death. So basically, if we don't kill you, you weren't tortured. And if we kill you, then we killed you. Probably because you were like the worst terrorist in the world or whatever.
Yeah. Later in 2010, Cheney goes on ABC's This Week and says he's still in favor of waterboarding and that I was and remain a strong proponent of our enhanced interrogation program. So he's defiant, I assume to this day, that he would do it again, even though it didn't work. Do you know how many people? So the 43 people that they were killed in black sites, or did anybody die in Guantanamo?
Yeah, that was in one of the books I read. I should have sourced that. And how many people were tortured? I have to. We need more data on that. This is kind of an impromptu Cheney episode, but whatever happened, Cheney was very forward, hasn't apologized. And if he was in charge, I think we'd still be torturing or down to torture to this day. Because at no point we see like, oh, we don't have to torture anymore. Things are safer. That's not his vibe at all. He's unapologetic for everything he did.
Yeah. So then, after the war on terror has begun, you have, what they're trying to pitch as a continuation of it in the Iraq War, and then that kind of by 2005 they pivoted as to be like, oh well, this is like a different thing. This is a side project, because at this point it's been proven that there was no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda, and no threat of weapons of mass destruction. But before that, there's a lot of concern that Iraq is developing WMDs, that they were responsible for 9/11, just like they're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the case for war. And we now know that going back to like after 9/11, Bush had it out for Iraq. He wanted to take on Saddam Hussein. Cheney runs these discussions about the war in the summer of 2002, to talk about what the plan would be for a war. And he goes over to the CIA and tries to get them to find some information. And at this point, even Bush is saying to George Tenet, who's the CIA director, that the public isn't going to buy their WMD case. It's just not going to be convincing. So they really got to work on this. They got to punch it up. And
yeah, but by the time Powell goes to the UN, like they're throwing things in that are a little that have already maybe been disproven, or that they're real, like they're like, oh, these aluminum tubes, they're for nukes or for chemicals or something like that. They really have to push to make the case as good as they can. And yeah, we can get into this. Yeah, there's the 16 words that Bush says in one of it, and I think it's a 2003 State of the Union that's like basically just a bold-faced lie about trying to get weapons.
Yeah. And Dick Cheney, he's kind of in a throwback to his 90s position. He is kind of concerned about doing this unilaterally, and he this is Dick Armey. So Dick Armey, different guy. All right, I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, Dick Armey's going against it, and then Cheney's like, no, we should do this.
Yeah, Dick Armey is a different Dick, is saying that we should not do this unilaterally, and that we need, the French and others to come in and help us. And Dick Cheney, in, a reversal of his position in the 90s, says, fuck off, we're going to do this no matter what.
We'll be greeted like the Allies when they liberated Paris, he tells them.
Right. So Cheney has, a really close relationship with Bush, and is able to really mold his views on a lot of this foreign policy stuff. They are, continuing to run with the 9/11 connection line, and there's a classified presidential brief in late September 2001 after 9/11 that says they have not been able to find any evidence linking Saddam to 9/11, and that there was scant credible evidence that Iraq had any significant collaborative ties with Al Qaeda. But they're still like hinting at this publicly going into 2002. And Cheney, as late as 2014, was saying that Hussein had a 10-year relationship with Al Qaeda, even though it's been well established that was not true. So the war is authorized in October 2002. The invasion begins in March, after this kind of dance where you try to get the UN to support it, and everybody's like, there's no evidence of anything you're talking about. And it's easy to knock out Saddam, but then after that, you have the things that Dick Cheney warned about years earlier. and it's extremely mismanaged. $17 billion is stolen from reconstruction funds. It's never accounted for. Cheney is going on TV and saying that Saddam Hussein has reconstituted nukes, which I don't know. Is that like a...
Oh yeah, like he he says they've seen evidence that he's reconstituted his nuclear program. At one point he says that on TV in the run up to the war. But it's more, but the intelligence is not saying that. It's like maybe he wants to do it or something like that. But
right.
Yeah, Cheney's willing to go lie and even go beyond the intelligence in a little bit. He knows he can kind of get away with a little bit of a lie on TV here and there. And he's pushing hard. And then once the wars, once we knock the Saddam statue, take Baghdad, he thinks any insurgency is just going to be go away once we capture Saddam, and that is not the case.
Right. So yeah, they think the insurgency is going to go away. Rumsfeld kind of checks out on the war after Baghdad is taken, and he wants to leave his post of the Secretary of Defense. And I think at one point Bush even refuses to accept his resignation, but Cheney.
Yes.
Cheney at this point is really adamant that Rumsfeld stay, and then later in 2006 he leaves after the Republicans do really badly in the midterm. In 2007, so when they get a new Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld is called the best ever Secretary of Defense by Dick Cheney, which is I guess low praise.
It's kind of crazy because this is at the low point. This is pre-surge. This is when like Iraq's in a full civil war. And yeah, I think Rumsfeld needed, I mean, I don't know if he ever should have been hired. He's, Cheney helps him get the job initially. But once there's no WMD, they should have gotten rid of Rumsfeld. The time in 2004, Rumsfeld offers his resignation after Abu Ghraib. Bush doesn't accept it. And then the whole time after that, just Cheney is a big voice advocating for Rumsfeld. And they even sacrificed the 2006 midterm elections because they could have fired Rumsfeld ahead of them and maybe won a few more seats. But instead, they wait till after the midterms to fire Rumsfeld. And even then, Cheney's not happy about it, but he agrees to deliver the news.
Right. So Cheney, to this day, I think would still defend the war in Iraq. He calls it an enormous success story. He says the critics are opportunists who are peddling cynical and pernicious falsehoods. John Kerry responds that it's hard to name a government official with less credibility than Dick Cheney. There's an extended interview he gives in March of 2008 during the 5th anniversary of the invasion, and he's confronted with opinion polls that say Americans have lost confidence in the war. And Dick Cheney just says, so? And this gets him a lot of criticism, but I remember him saying this in interviews at the time, when the worm was turning with public opinion in the war. He was saying, well, Americans have an opportunity every 4 years to change policies like this, and they didn't do it. So too bad. And then in kind of the mid Bush years, you have a big scandal which became a December song, Valerie Plame. What happened there?
Okay, so yeah, Valerie Plame's a CIA agent. At some point, she's an analyst, but she'd been undercover. And her husband wrote an article at some point, I believe Joe Wilson. He basically writes an article disproving this thing that Bush had said in the State of the Union in 2003. It's called the 16 Words. He said, the British government had learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. The idea being that he's going to use them to make a nuclear bomb. And maybe the British government really told Bush this, but it wasn't true. He hadn't really done that. And when the articles come out, someone in the Republicans gets revenge on Wilson by outing Valerie Plame as a CIA agent, and it might actually be it might actually be that Scooter Libby's not the leaker, per se, but he ends up getting in trouble for like perjuring himself about it. I forget who. I think Richard Armitage or something like that. Yeah, that's the guy who ends up getting Armitage. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was thinking Armitage, but yeah, Richard Armitage. Yeah, he's the guy who leaks it, but it could be also like that Libby was coordinating it. But basically, Cheney and Libby's hands are all over this, and Libby does ultimately get convicted of lying, and then we'll kind of get into more about that.
Yeah. And, as we said on the Kerry episode, I think Cheney really wants Bush to pardon Libby and just kind of assumes that he will because he's done basically everything else that Dick Cheney has said. And Bush refuses and eventually says he's tired of hearing about it, so stop bringing it up. And he just is furious that he isn't able to get this guy off. But
I do want to say it's kind of BS because here's what happened. He gets convicted. He's sentenced like 2.5 years. Bush is like, well, that's too many years. I'll just commute his sentence. So he doesn't go to jail, but he is a convict. He can't be a lawyer anymore or whatever. I'm sure he can work. I'm sure he got some like lucrative job working for some kind of like, one of those lobbyists or something. We'd have to look it up. But Libby's doing fine. But Cheney's just like, you can't leave a soldier in the field. You must give him a full pardon. And honestly, it's kind of unfair that Cheney is now going against Trump because Trump does eventually pardon Libby years later, just because Trump would just do pardons to be kind of a jerk. So like he pardoned Joe Arpaio and almost pardoned the Tiger King guy, which would have actually been fun. That would have been one good pardon. But yeah, so he does eventually get pardoned from Trump. I don't know if it affected his life that much, but it's not like Libby's rotting away in jail. Libby did not spend a day in prison. Bush commuted his sentence.
There you go. There's also something we should mention from the 2004 is that, and I think this had probably an impact on the election, but there is intelligence that I believe is true that in 1996, Saddam did destroy some chemical weapons that he'd probably used against Iran, I would assume, but that was a small, teeny tiny feather in the Bush-Cheney campaign's cap that like he had chemical weapons at one point. He just got rid of them. Whether or not, I mean,
oh yeah. So see, to me, yeah, yeah.
It is a far cry from nukes that can be shot at the United States.
Oh yeah, absolutely. To me, it's that I think there was a factory that could have made them, and that factory was decommissioned in '96. And the last inspections had been in '98, so it's kind of like he really wasn't even close to having chemical weapons for a very long time before '03.
Right. You have and domestically too. This came out in July of 2008. The midst of that presidential year. But there's a former EPA official who said that the vice president's office tried to get large-scale deletions from the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, the prevention report on the health effects of global warming, because they feared the presentation by a leading health official might make it harder to avoid regulating greenhouse gases. And they get 6 pages cut out from this person's testimony, and then the White House, Bush's White House, says that those changes were made because of concerns regarding the accuracy of the science. But Stephen Johnson, who was the former senior advisor for the EPA on climate change, said that it was definitely Cheney's office who was responsible for half of that original testimony being deleted. And I don't know what inaccuracies they were referring to, but in general, it's pretty obvious that climate change is happening at this point. Republicans aren't even denying it. It's before that stage in their, grief spectrum. But yeah, it would have been good to know in the aughts that, and this would have been effective messaging instead of like Al Gore talking about icebergs and stuff. If you actually have somebody say like, you are going to get sick from climate change, so let's do something about it.
There is a thing late in the Bush administration. He's considering doing cap and trade. And I think Cheney helped squash it. And he's saying you got to do a carbon tax across the board. But yeah, pre-Tea Party, which was definitely big polluter type people like the Kochs, getting people to be against any kind of climate change fight. There is a chance of Republicans and Democrats working together to do some climate policy that would have put us in a better shape today. But obviously, a Dick Cheney type guy is super against that.
Yeah. A little bit more about the 2004 reelection campaign. His last campaign running for vice president yet again. There's one debate between John Edwards and Dick Cheney. And I remember watching this as a kid. I thought that it was going to be like Nixon, Kennedy. Edwards was just going to seem so much more charismatic than this old fart who's evil. But Cheney actually does a pretty good job because he's a good debater, and he's really not afraid to fight dirty. There's the first question, though, is about Paul Bremer, who's saying that there was never enough troops on the ground in Iraq. And there's a report on no link found between Zarqawi, who's like the head of the insurgency at this point, and bin Laden. And Cheney responds with, well, that's the most likely nexus, that there's some connection. You know, they probably know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows both. You know, there's probably like 10 degrees of separation between Zarqawi and bin Laden, so they might as well be in the same network, and we can treat this as a front on the war on terror. And he says they would have done Iraq again, and the world is far safer for this.
Yeah, and he says it was the exactly right thing to do. He says it once, and then he ends on that. So he's completely unapologetic. But yeah, it doesn't move the needle campaign wise. But yeah, just another case of him being unapologetic, and helping, and him and Bush, they stay on message and they win re-election.
Right. Yeah, and when we do John Edwards episode, we'll talk about this. But he is effective in that debate in calling Edwards Senator Gone, because he says he's never in the Senate taking votes and that he's never met him before, and that's a lie. They had met, and for whatever reason, Edwards just doesn't bite on pointing that out.
So they've been at the same prayer breakfast.
Yeah,
I couldn't picture either of those guys giving a crap about praying, though.
I mean, if he believes in God, I'm sure John Edwards has done a lot of praying for forgiveness to try to get off the hook for some stuff. So Bush is reelected. Cheney kind of reverts back to being a normal vice president. He's powerless, except in helping Bush do things that he already wants, and isn't shaping policy as much. And he's not that interested in, domestic policy or stuff that he's not excited about, or that, he doesn't have an interest in.
Can I? So in the first term, it's not that Cheney's the boss. It's that Bush is the boss, but he mostly agrees with Cheney. He believes in Cheney. He trusts him, and he kind of lets Cheney have his way. And then when there's no WMD, that is a cloud over his whole administration. He never gets really any more domestic policy done after the no WMD thing. So Cheney is just kind of on the back burner, and it's going to become Bush and Condi. And Condi's really good in that she's not as opinionated, and she's really good at helping Bush do what he really wants to do.
Right. And this became a big story, a big punchline for the late night comics of the day. But
it was great.
Cheney shoots a man in the face. There's a hunting accident, supposedly. Wouldn't put it past Cheney to intentionally do that. But the guy apologizes to Cheney.
It's crazy. It's one of the funnier things. It was basically the equivalent of like when Trump got COVID in 2020. It was good. This is still peak Jon Stewart in his first run on the Daily Show. It's amazing. The thing that Cheney is, he does pay a price because he handles they don't care about him shooting the guy. The guys are right. Everything you read says it was an accident, but no one who was there is going to ever tell you if it wasn't. So yeah, it's all speculation. But Cheney handles the communication so poorly, it kind of makes him more of a sideshow, and it helps sideline him even further in the administration.
Right. Also, he's really consistent on wanting torture to be allowed. McCain at this time is an opponent of the Bush administration on torture because he was tortured, and this opposition gets him a lecture from Dick Cheney. And
Cheney's basically like if more planes hit, it's on you. Like he's like really going hard.
Jesus.
Yeah, Cheney when he cares, he goes real hard. He's mostly quiet, but if he's got something to say, he's going to really say it.
Right. And he's able to kind of spin this bill as a victory for the Bush administration because he's able to get some of the provisions taken out. And so he turns it into kind of a celebration. He's also very passionate about not closing black sites. Because, this is the Bush administration is in its second act. Everybody's kind of sick of hearing about Bush, hearing about torture and all this extrajudicial stuff the U.S. is doing. But Cheney's like, we gotta keep these black sites open throughout the Middle East. That eventually they are closed, despite him, but everyone just gets put in Gitmo.
So he's on a meeting. He's in one of these meetings. He doesn't talk usually. People who on these meetings who've never heard him talk, and he's going so hard at like we got to keep these sites open. Like people like I don't even know that he could talk, and he's saying all that. Yeah, I will say with the torture bill, basically they're able to use like some Bush legal team version of torture. It doesn't apply to the past. And then the marketing is like, well, look at all this crazy stuff we did to keep you safe over the years. Aren't you proud of us? There hasn't been another attack because of all this torture we did. So like they're able to really spin everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to imagine Kamala Harris as vice president being like, we have to just being really passionate about keeping black sites open, just some like really specific and evil policy that the vice president. Yeah, it is unusual that he was in charge of this much stuff and in on this much stuff as VP. 2006, this is topical. There's a war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Cheney tells Bush to let Israel finish the job with Hezbollah, let them do whatever they need to take them out. But Condoleezza Rice sways Bush into putting an end to it through diplomacy after 34 days.
Oh yeah, it's great. Yeah, the Lebanon stuff, it's going on right now. It happened in 2006. It happened in 1982. There's a Chomsky book about that. So it's been going on my whole life because post the peace deal in 1979, Israel's been on offense. And the crazy thing with the 2006 one is Anthony Bourdain is shooting a no reservation special about Beirut. He's over there, and then the attack happens. And I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, but Hassan Piker just did a stream where he watched it. And it's like kind of insane because Bourdain's like, well, we get to go back, but these people here, they just have to live with it. And it helps you kind of see what it's like on the ground in Beirut. Because Beirut is, it's got a lot in common with New York, and they try to have a good time and have culture and have fun, but they're also just being bombed so often. And New York's the city that never sleeps. Beirut's the city that never dies. We're praying for them. I mean, I don't believe in God, but I'm praying for them at least, symbolically right now because they need help. They're going through it right now.
Wow. So, and domestically, this 2005 Hurricane Katrina is happening, and there's a task force that I think Bush wanted Cheney to head, but he wants to be able to hire and fire people. So it's not enough control for him. So he turns it down. Maybe he would have done a better job than the people who were in charge. But
when he's motivated, he does a good job. Yeah, Bush is very much like we can't do too much to nationalize it. Bush is very much like small government, at least initially with Katrina. And the worst part is that there's a picture of him flying over it, but he doesn't stop. And that picture ends up looking bad. And this is, the Katrina moment is kind of the moment when you lose your presidency. You could argue Biden had a Katrina moment with post October 7th and indefinitely post that first debate. And it did remind me a little bit of Dwight Schrute, where at one episode, Michael Scott asked him on The Office to headline a task force. He's like, "How many people can I fire?" So that did remind me a little bit of Dick Cheney. It would be funny if Dick Cheney was like, "Well, I'm not helping with the hurricane, but I fired 10 people out of this government."
Well, I mean, unironically, I think he probably would have done a better job than what happened. Because, yeah, nobody was in charge. There's Brown, the head of FEMA, Brownie, as Bush called him. Maybe he would have gotten fired and someone more competent would have been put in his place. And like you said, when he put his mind to something, he could get it done. Maybe a lot of people would have been helped by a Dick Cheney, Katrina task force, but who knows? I mean, he also would have did what they ended up doing, like privatizing a bunch of shit and like putting Blackwater troops in the streets, to replace the police department. But so obviously he retires in 2009, and for a while he would resurface every now and again to make some snide comment about the Obama administration, who did not prosecute him or any of his contemporaries in the Bush years. That was, I think, a mistake. As Obama began by saying, "We're going to look forward, not back," which the question, I think, is, well, what kind of standard are you moving forward with if you're not going to apply the law to people who broke it, who are in positions of power? It's unclear what the U.S.'s policy is on all this stuff if you're going to let all of this just kind of melt away. He goes out to Wyoming, and so he'll be interviewed by people on his ranch and stuff. I don't know if he has any more health problems. That was something I want to make sure to mention, is that this was a recurring joke throughout the Bush administration, is that Cheney had just tons of heart attacks. And I remember one joke being that he was asked to release his health records, and he only released the first volume, which is like 700 pages.
So I believe he had 3 before the 2000 election. He may have some flare up during the transition. And then he has he might have I think he has 1 or 2 more after they retire. But then he gets this heart transplant, which is depicted at the end of the movie Vice. And since then, he's been a lot healthier. Now, whether he should have been the priority for a heart transplant, who knows? But he's got a new heart now, and he's doing good. And he's joined Kamala, and we're gonna have communism, and it's gonna be good. He's woke now, Dick Cheney. He's redeemed, and as long as you'll bomb Lebanon, he will vote Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising to hear he had a heart transplant, because transplant means he had one in the first place, which I think, the heart attacks do damage to the heart, which, if you believe in a soul, that's connected to the heart. So that's maybe why he was so evil. I do want to say also, 2008, in the vice presidential debate for that year, Biden went after Cheney, I remember, and was complaining that Cheney acted as a member of the Senate. He thought constitutionally he was allowed to be part of the Senate, and that offended Biden. And he did at least say that, in general, he was a really destructive vice president who was violating the Constitution. And so that's going to be his legacy.
Basically, Cheney's like, well, the VP, and they depict this a lot in Vice, the VP is a member of the executive branch and the legislative. So when it helps me, I'll be in legislative. When it helps me, I'll be in executive. Sometimes I'll be in both, and you can't get me. I'll be both or neither. Like, you can't regulate me. He had offices everywhere. He had an office in the CIA. He had one in the Senate, one in the House. Like, he's in a position to be a shadow government, and he probably is. There's a lot. We've only scratched the surface. So if you're listening and Dick Cheney evil that we didn't mention, feel free to send it, because there's no limit. And some stuff we'll never know, because he destroyed records and stuff like that.
In the meantime, thank you, everybody, for listening. At Vanquished Pod, it's Vanquished. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Vanquished. If you want the full thing, because there is more, please go to patreon.com/thevanquished, where you can get the rest of this episode, as well as our full episode catalog. You can support our work, as well as annoy us in the comments.